Très bienvenue, bienvenidos, and welcome to this session. We're looking forward to an active discussion over the next 90 minutes on investment funds for climate adaptation impact, good practices, and learning from leading examples. My name is Jason Spenceley. I'm Senior Climate Change Specialist at the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, where I work on strategies for private sector engagement in climate adaptation. And I have the pleasure to moderate this session today. As is the case with all sessions in this GEF-GCF Pavilion, we're being live streamed. And I understand we have strong participation or strong attendance virtually. This session and all sessions will also be available for posterity, for the history, on the website for this pavilion, which we're very proud to be doing together with our colleagues at the Green Climate Fund. We're really excited about this session in particular because design de-risking and the scale-up of investment funds for climate adaptation is a powerful opportunity and a growing movement, if I can call it that, for catalyzing localized climate adaptation impact at scale for vulnerable people around the world. It's also a key explicit element for financial support articulated in the Global Environment Facility's 4-year strategy for the next 4 years on climate adaptation, in an area where we're looking to deepening our partnerships and deepening our shared support, our blended support for climate adaptation impact. We're fortunate to have with us a very insightful panel of leaders and experts in climate adaptation investment, which I will briefly introduce before we dive in right into the discussions. First, on my immediate right, Brian Parham is manager of at Lightsmith Group and director of the Adaptation Accelerator project, known as ASAP. As you may know, Lightsmith Group is an investment fund manager that manages CRAFT, which is the first and, if I may say, highly successful private equity fund, public private equity fund for climate adaptation companies in developing country contexts. Next, on my next right, Mr. Christoph Grobbel is co-founder and CFO of Southpole, who manages the Landscape Resilience Fund. Southpole is a provider of climate products, climate solutions, and climate investments, helping corporates on their climate change journey. The Landscape Resilience Fund is one of the winners of the GEF Challenge program for adaptation innovation and is being supported by the GEF. Following, Maelis Carraro is director of the Catalyst Fund at BFA Global. The Catalyst Fund is a successful fintech investment facility for sustainable livelihoods in Africa. And I'd also like to recognize that Davide, the founder of BFA Global, is also with us. Next, Nadine Valat is representing the Sustainable Rice Landscapes Initiative, known as SRLI, and is a senior climate specialist at FAO. SRLI is an exciting up-and-coming investment fund for climate resilient rice production. And finally, last but not least, far away, but not so far, Patrick Nussbaumer is co-lead of the Adaptation Metrics Working Group and Senior Climate Specialist at UNIDO. The Adaptation Metrics Working Group is contributing to strengthen the way we measure and track directly the climate adaptation and resilience impacts of the sorts of funds that we're talking about, which is a key piece in the puzzle to strengthening our impact for adaptation. Now, before we turn it over to the panel, I would just like to invite you to consider 3 key elements or 3 key good practices in terms of the design and development of public-private investment funds for climate adaptation impact. First, how do we develop the how of developing initial design and establishing of the funds, including how do we finance and how can we best blend our funds in that hard, early stage of development. Second, how do we go about initial capitalization of the funds, and how can we best blend our finance, I mean public and private finance, to capitalize the funds? And third, how do we best go about developing the pipeline of investments, of bankable projects, TA facilities? What does that look like? For directly to achieve the adaptation and resilience impacts we all want to achieve. So, with that, we will now go through a couple of rounds of discussion. It's an informal, free-flowing discussion. We will, of course, have plenty of time for audience to ask questions, to share your reflection, and really we want to just have an open conversation. There have been issues with the sound. We'll do our best. Let's cross our fingers. So, Brian, please, of Lightsmith Group. Craft, managed by Lightsmith, is, as we've said, a highly successful equity fund, and it's the first that we know of dedicated to climate adaptation and resilience in developing countries. Tell us the story, please, and tell us, and in doing so, what are the keys to success, and what should we be avoiding, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. First, I want to say the CRAFT Fund, it is an acronym. It stands for the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance Technology Transfer Facility, which is more of a mouthful than CRAFT. But so I want to take you on a little bit of a journey of how CRAFT came to be and kind of where we are today. So at COP23, the GEF and NDF announced a $1.6 million grant to develop the CRAFT strategy coming out of the CPI lab. So, and then by COP24, we had secured the first approvals of investor commitments from the EIB, the Nordic Development Fund, and Luxembourg. Following at COP25 is when we closed the first round of the fund. And then at COP26, we announced the CRAFT Technical Assistance Facility, which is kind of a parallel program to the CRAFT Fund, which was originally planned in the creation of CRAFT. So then in COP26, we also announced that the GCF would join the fund as the final contributor, which we then closed the fund in January 2022 at $185 million to disseminate out to and invest in climate adaptation companies. So now at COP27, we're happy to be announcing the launching of the CRAFT Technical Assistance Facility. We're breaking ground on the first project, which is with Source Global, and we will be launching a pilot program of their hydro panels technology that delivers clean drinkable water to 2 communities in Papua New Guinea. So from 2017 to today, we've been able to scale up the investment fund to be fully funded and then roll out the technical assistance facility as we had planned initially. So to add, the project broke ground this week and we will be delivering water to these communities by Christmas. So that's how fast these things can move when you bring the private sector in here. So from that $1 million that GEF initially financed, there's been 189-time multiple in capital mobilized. And the initial funding allowed us to basically de-risk the development of the concept and then led to the GCF joining into the partnership. So it's definitely an example of GEF and GCF collaboration. So, but we are the first, but we also don't want to be the last. We think there's room for hundreds of funds like us to join in investing in climate adaptation to address the investment gap that we all know exists. And we need to do it faster. We did it in 5 years. We need to scale up so that these can be fully operational. The sooner the better. So I wanted to cover 3 kind of key areas of how we develop the fund. The first is in the fund design. So really looking to de-risk the investments, especially in the climate that we have with inflation growing. So we use the blended finance structure where the fund is structured with junior and senior capital. We use a lot of the public funding to take the first loss in order to crowd in additional private investors to grow the fund. So, and on top of that, the initial GEF funds helped us to de-risk the idea so that we could actually develop it. Then the second is technical assistance and advisory support. So a lot of the programs could use money to pilot or launch their technologies in markets that would not necessarily get the technology right away. So Papua New Guinea would not be getting these hydro panels in this year, if maybe not even in the next 5, because it's not like a prominent market. And so our idea is to roll this out as a pilot project and then scale up to the broader SIDS, hopefully over the next couple of years. The second is looking at deal flow and pipeline development. Don't underestimate the work that it has to go into the deal flow and pipeline development. Getting ideas from conception to bankability is a long process and requires lots of support to these companies. So the GEF also supports the Adaptation SME Accelerator Program, which is part of Lightsmith's efforts to grow the pipeline and the ecosystem and adaptation investments, and that's the program that I oversee. And we just completed an accelerator supporting 16 companies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, expanding on earlier stage climate adaptation solutions. And then the last point is the importance of ESG and impact measurement. So both GEF and GCF have been critical in helping Lightsmith develop our ESG planning as a part of the conception of the project. And through both the ASAP taxonomy and our internal metric tool that we use, we're able to report on our portfolio companies, but we do recognize that it's still very broad in how we look at metrics, and it really needs a lot more work to be put into it.
Brian, we really appreciate that because, at least from the GEF's perspective, Craft has been a real trailblazer, and if I can say, extremely successful. The initial GEF investment in Craft was $1 million US dollars. It's now capitalized at 170. Is that correct?
185.
180. Every time we speak, it's higher. Capitalized at 185 million, and there's a scale-up strategy which is advancing very well with the Green Climate Fund. So for us, it's a model. And it's a trailblazer, and we're really appreciative for your sharing of examples of what works and what doesn't with others, because we're together as an ecosystem creating a movement, creating a wave of public-private blended investment for climate adaptation impact. So this is why we're so happy to have a series on the way that we're partnering, that the GEF is happy to partner with to do much, much more. Christoph, you are a co-founder of Southpole. Southpole, which is growing, I understand, by leaps and bounds in accompanying corporates on their climate journey. And you've made a bet, if I can call it that, on climate adaptation and resilience as an investable product. Tell us why. Tell us how you see that and how we can best work together.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jason. And thanks a lot for the invitation. First of all, for those of you who don't know Southpole, the name Southpole stands for two things. First of all, Southpole is of course 3 kilometers thick of ice, something we want to prevent from melting in this whole fight against climate change. And it stands for the global south. And that's where most of the impact is being felt and where we talk about most of the required adaptation projects. Southpole has about 1,100 employees by now. And I think I have to give you the context. We work in three business lines, as you pointed out. One is projects, climate projects. We help setting up projects to a large extent in developing countries, but as well in the developed world to avoid emissions, reduce emissions, finance them. The next one is, coming to this, these climate solutions. Climate solutions, in this business line, we help corporates on their entire sustainability journey. We calculate the footprints of corporates. We have models to look on the physical climate risks in supply chains. That's exactly the topic we're addressing here with the fund. We clean up supply chains of large corporates, look on the water risk, on deforestation risks, go through all the products of the large corporates of the world that you know. We help corporates to switch towards 100% renewable, but really everything from screening the rooftops, writing power purchasing agreements on the ground, helping them to compensate the rest of their footprints and doing climate strategies, up to the communication. We even have a communications agency. That's the climate solutions part. And then the climate investments part is where we have a number of vehicles which act in this impact space. And you can imagine now from the climate solutions part, we know which problems the global multinationals have. They look on their supply chains and see the risks that they have when they source all kind of products, physical climate risks. And these corporates typically are already quite far on when they work with us on their journey towards net zero. They do everything that they can do. But the supply chain is of course an important element that is more difficult to tackle. We do projects to reduce emissions in the supply chains, but of course now how to get the supply chains more resilient. And then that was the idea as well to set up the Landscape Resilience Fund. And this fund has been kind of sponsored initially with about a bit more than $1 million from GEF, which we're very grateful for, and as well from Chanel. Chanel committed $25 million to this fund as a grant, and we set up jointly with the WWF, a foundation in Switzerland. I see WWF as well here represented in the panel. We set up a foundation which we manage jointly with the WWF to manage this Landscape Resilience Fund. And the fund helps corporates, small corporates, startups on the ground in these developing countries that in the fight against, not just against climate change, but in the adaptation side to make the local farmers more resilient to climate change. Now you said about what's the don'ts and do's. First of all, I think it's extremely important to have an anchor investor on any. I don't know if I'm loud enough, but to have an anchor investor. I would never set up any kind of fund without having a significant anchor investor to start with. In our case, Chanel coming with this 25 million. Because if you just have an idea and then you try to find somebody to finance it, that's probably a difficult pitch. Every anchor investor has the specificities that you have to build the whole thing around. Not totally sure if I can influence that here, but probably not. Probably not. Then the other important thing is, of course, we believe we need a TA facility, and this money from GEF is a mix of TA facility and first loss. Many projects or many companies in developing countries, startups are not bankable. It's difficult to give loans to them. And in a sense, this entire first money, currently we're at 25 million and we want to scale it to 100 million. So we're welcoming other grants into this, but we want to first check this first tranche overall as an experiment, basically. This entire fund acts in the same way as a venture philanthropist.
Sorry, is there something we can do with the sound
on the technique here
to not have the squeaking? I saw the technician went around the corner. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Maybe.
Should I put it a bit further? I'm not sure if.
Can you see if these are? I'm gonna turn off. Let's use one mic.
Okay. Sound check. Yes. This one is still working. Everything else off? No, this one works well. I just make sure everything else is off. Okay.
Maelis, can you turn off yours?
Maybe it's a bit down. Oh, yeah. Okay, that sounds better.
That sounds better.
Yes. Okay. So we believe I talked about TA facility and first loss tranches in a certain sense, because this facility is now just being fed so far by grants. This entire facility is the first loss tranche in a bigger picture. We act as a venture philanthropist, so we want to use the money several times. This fund gives out loans and hopefully gets the money back to a good extent and can give it out again. But once we figured out what's the likelihood of getting it back and how to play this entire game, we want to get probably a commercial tranche next to it. And if you have a commercial tranche, of course, it gets important to have some kind of first loss tranches and so on to get it done overall to make it scalable. I mean, 25 million is a good start, but we think bigger, of course. And maybe let's speak.
Next. Thank you very much. We're really excited about the work with Southpole and the Landscape Resilience Fund. When we made the initial decision and the announcement to support Landscape Resilience Fund with approximately 1 million to help set up the fund and develop a technical assistance facility for pipeline, it was about 3 months later that the 25 million commitment from Chanel came in. 25 million over 5 years. I think this speaks to the speed, about going faster. It is possible to go fast, sometimes even working with a multilateral, sometimes. So we need more of those big wins. And continuing on the big win continuum, Maelis Carraro from BFA Global, the director of the highly successful Catalyst Fund, which focuses on fintech solutions, early stage development, Africa. Please tell us about the journey and how together we will deepen the climate resilience elements of the Catalyst Fund.
Absolutely. This is working, right? No echo? Great. So starting with the journey, Catalyst Fund, as you said, actually began 7 years ago. I can't believe it's already been 7 years. David and I was here in the audience, started it to be basically the first facility that would provide early stage capital, the first capital into startups, combined with very hands-on and bespoke venture building support, because we deeply believed as entrepreneurs ourselves that capital was only one side of the equation, and it's not enough. Like, you actually do need the very hands-on technical and market-based support at the beginning of your journey as an entrepreneur to find product market fit and then to scale. So we started with a philanthropic approach as well. Our first backing came from the Gates Foundation and JP Morgan Chase Foundation. And then over time, we scaled the project with government funding. So FCDO, UK Aid came in, other corporates like PayPal, who may be in the room, MasterCard Foundation, and others. And our focus had always been leveraging fintech innovation to build the financial resilience of vulnerable communities in emerging markets. Over these 7 years, working with now 61 companies across 15 emerging markets, 70% of the portfolio being in Africa, we obviously took a broader lens to the definition of fintech and invested across several sectors, including agriculture, aquaculture, access to energy, access to clean cook stoves, but always with an embedded finance lens to it. Like, what is the product, be it digital payments or embedded credit or embedded savings or insurance, that can actually unlock the scale and access of these solutions for the most vulnerable and last mile populations, because that's usually the issue. You may have solutions, but are not reaching those that need them the most. And in that period, we also realized that those communities who are lower income, again, last mile, and lack access to tools to build their resilience and protection, we're the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And we're already affected, because we're working with millions now of smallholder farmers, of aquaculture farmers. That's the individuals who contributed the least are going to suffer the most. So with this experience and track record that we've developed over time with these partners, we decided with GEF support, which we're very grateful for, that last year at COP26, David was here on the stage receiving the prize for, as well as FSD Africa. Julian is actually in the audience as our first anchor investor, which I agree is extremely important, are launching a fund. We call it our third fund, but really it's our first equity facility dedicated solely to investing in resilient solutions for climate vulnerable communities in Africa. So it's a really exciting moment for us, because we're finally really leveraging the experience that we've had, but blending different forms of capital, now equity capital and grants capital, and maintaining our core philosophy of also blending capital and really technical hands-on support to make sure that there are more bankable solutions, as they were pointing out earlier, in the market for other investors. So briefly, to say more briefly, Catalyst Fund's purpose is to de-risk a pipeline of climate resilient solutions for Africa, combine this catalytic investment in capital and the venture building support, so that we're really working hand in hand with the entrepreneurs, and create a bigger ecosystem of solutions, because certainly we need a lot more to face the challenge of climate change today. So that's a summary of us. And in terms of the do's and don'ts, I echo everything that has already been said. So for us, it was really important to think about the design, how we're going to structure a blended finance facility that is able to attract commercial capital from the get-go, but with a first loss philanthropic layer that is de-risking the whole venture, because we're going so early stage, we're taking enormous risks. Like, you know, it's companies that have a very unproven product in market and need to do everything so the business model becomes viable. So that was one element. How do we structure the stack? Who do we go to? How can we have an anchor investor aligned in our mission and vision to see to fruition? That was GEF and FSDA. And then the other is thinking about how we're plugging the holes in the ecosystem. So how can we complement Southpole, complement Craft and ASAP, and together be part of this ecosystem of funds that are working towards the same objective. And I think that's perhaps complementary with what my colleagues have said, because we do need to take an holistic view to this problem.
Beautiful. I love that term. Let's use that, an ecosystem of funds. Another in the family or the ecosystem of funds is the Sustainable Rice Landscape Initiative. Nadine, who represents the Sustainable Rice Landscape Initiative, sometimes it goes by SRLI, is a key actor in the development of the initiative. The initiative is in, if I can say, in its early stages, earlier stages anyway. Tell us about SRLI, Nadine, and why blended finance is such a key strategy to go to the scale.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel with so many innovators. That's very inspiring for somebody
Microphone closer, please.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, and very inspiring to hear these innovations, especially for me, who is representing the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which might not always, for many of you, be associated with innovation. So it's really inspiring to hear that. I think I'm part of the FAO, as a UN organization, is part of this ecosystem you were describing, because FAO is an agency who provides technical assistance, has been a long partner of GEF, is a partner of the GCF. And exactly a year ago, like many of you, FAO was here in this pavilion where there was the announcement of the winners of the challenge program. And FAO was very proud to be one of the partners for 3 winning projects, including the Sustainable Rice Landscape Initiative, and which we are doing together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And it's really a pleasure to be back here a year after and to take stock of where we are. The facilities that we are developing aims to catalyze public and private sector investment to scale up adaptation and resilience building in rice landscape in Asia, so very focused. Why rice? Maybe it's very obvious for many of you, but it's a daily staple for over 3.5 billion, so almost half of the world population. But it also its production also requires using 15% of the world's wetlands and 40% of the world's irrigation water. So sustainable rice production is really very, very important. I mean, we will need to continue to produce rice, but we need to produce it in a more sustainable and climate resilient way. And this facility aims at doing that and going beyond what we have been doing so far by linking with private sector investment. The seed funding from the GEF will enable the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and FAO to design the blended finance facility and assess the applicability of the approach in 3 countries in Asia: Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam. We have made plenty of progress in the past year, maybe not as quick as some of the progress I've been hearing of. And we are about to conclude the project preparation phase next month and launch implementation of the facility design work with the key partners very soon in the coming months. The facility will include several financing mechanisms, including a loan facility and country-level revolving funds, and a grant facility. We also will be able to develop adaptation metrics for the finance facility, and I think that my neighbor will pick up on that, which will establish a framework to measure impact and helping create trust with investors, because I think that's really key for everyone to be able to invest. We are leveraging existing partnerships from the Sustainable Rice Landscape Initiative under the GEF-7 Food Systems Impact Program. And we have engaged with new financial partners and are in advanced discussion with IFC, who could potentially be the fund manager of the facility. So it's really great to see this opportunity to develop blended finance. And what we're really looking forward also, but that will be for later in the discussion, is how we can take this blended facility to a bigger scale and scale it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to highlight that the most recent of the three funds that you've heard were all winners through a highly competitive process of the GEF Challenge Program for Adaptation Innovation. And the most recent two were announced just a year ago at the last COP. The Landscape Resilience Fund was announced at the previous COP in Madrid. And each of the funds that you're hearing about are partnered together with a GEF agency, Conservation International, in the case of Craft, World Wildlife Fund, as you mentioned, Christoph, in the case of the Landscape Resilience Fund, the Catalyst Fund, partnering together with UNIDO. Alois, thank you for being with us. And of course, FAO with the Sustainable Rice Landscape Initiative. Now, we're all driving for adaptation impact and resilience impact. How really do we assure that that's what we're achieving, and how do we maximize the impact with every dollar? Do we have a metrics that shows that we're doing that? How do we decide if one business, we're investing in businesses, how is one business deriving more impact, adaptation impact, than another? Based on what? Patrick, we've been talking about this, we've been having this conversation for years. You had the guts to take on being co-lead, and thank you, of what we're calling the Adaptation Metrics Working Group. Tell us why you think this is important and what we can do about it.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you for creating the opportunity to touch upon the issue of metrics in the context of a discussion like this. So, indeed, there is no commonly agreed impact framework to assess and quantify the positive impact that an SME might make when it comes to climate adaptation. In other words, there is no equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions, if you want, in the context of mitigation. And this is an issue because we are unable to effectively direct climate finance to where it matters. There is an increased interest in adaptation. There is an increased availability of climate finance for adaptation. And it is critical that we have the tools that we need to decide whether we should support business A or business B. It is against that background that we have created a working group to try to work through that issue. So bringing together a few clever minds and try to understand what exists, what is out there, to see if there is anything that we can use and build from to get to the tool that we think we should have. So that working group that we created together with our colleagues from BFA Global is composed of investors, composed of fund managers, but there are also multilateral funds, there are development agencies, there are also consultancies, people that are measuring impact for a business. We've done a few consultations during the years, and most importantly, we have carried out a landscape review. So we have spoken to people who have spoken to people, if you want, to make sure that we cast the net very wide and to see what is out there, to not only verify that hypothesis that there is no framework that we can apply to SME, but also to get some inspiration from what already exists. The key takeaway that we have is very clearly there is a need for such a tool, there is a need for such a metric, and there is appetite from investors to accelerators and others. What we have seen applied in the market at the moment is relatively rudimentary. its course in terms of methodology, but it is also based mostly on secondary data and on expert judgment. So there is definitely room for improvement there. The other thing that we have realized is that there is a lack of capacity, notably on the SME side, first of all, to understand the concept of climate adaptation, let alone to measure the impact that they make. And there we realize very clearly in working with those SMEs that there are very few SMEs out there that are selling a product or a service for climate adaptation purposes. They normally deal with a broader set of challenge. They deal with water issues, they deal with crop failure, they deal with cooling in a food value chain, and climate is one factor that they are addressing with their product and services. So there is very little capacity, as far as we can see, for those businesses to articulate the positive impact that they might make. And that is a problem, because if they are unable to do that, they are ineligible, if you want, for the increasing flow of climate finance that is becoming available. So this is why we think this is critical to equip those companies so that they can access those opportunities, but also critical to have those tools so that we can direct the financing flow where it makes the biggest impact. We have written a working paper that we are releasing in the context of this climate conference that I can make available if interested, and then we are engaging with a range of stakeholders to take the next step on trying to crack that very hard nut.
Excellent, and thank you. Couldn't agree more that this is critical, because if we can crack this very hard nut of what is adaptation impact from an investor perspective, from a business perspective, this movement will go much further, to use your analogy, and much further. Excellent. We're going to come around with a quicker round this time, 1 or 2 minutes, a couple of quick questions. Brian, we've been working together for quite a while now. We, GEF and Lightsmith and GCF, you're pioneers in blending finance for climate adaptation impact. Tell us what we can do better. How does blending work well?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to just build off of kind of Patrick's point about adaptation is way more than what a lot of people kind of picture as traditional adaptation. It's more than seawalls. It's focusing on the core elements that we need as a society to function. You know, elements like water and food. And what we found in the Adaptation SME Accelerator program is that companies don't think of themselves as climate adaptation. And so really it's all part of the ecosystem building. I think that the GEF can help really, and the GCF can help drive the broader ecosystem building, because Lightsmith at its core is a private equity investment firm, and companies need to be to a certain size for the fund to invest in. And so we're really encouraging, identifying the companies and facilitating technical assistance programs and building out that support so that the broader ecosystem can build up faster. And the big thing that I think that can help it, the GCF and the GEF can help with, is de-risking all of it. Because in this current inflationary environment, private investors are just fleeing away from investments like this, developing world investments in adaptation. And so bringing in that public money to help keep the momentum going, I think will be really important over the next couple years.
It's interesting, isn't it? With interest rates increasing, we're asking ourselves, so what does that mean for blending? Interest rates are increasing. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that means that rare, valuable, limited public finance is even more crucial, and how we use it to catalyze larger scale commercial investment is even more critical. Christoph, please tell us what you think. You're providing a range of services, holistic services, if you will, to corporates on their climate journey. What are corporates' biggest challenges, and how can we address them together?
Thanks, microphone's still working. I think there is a willingness of corporates to invest into this topic. So it's about finding the right vehicles that are investable. And this fund, maybe I can build as well on the leveraging of the money part that you mentioned before. I just thought about all the cascades that you started off with the GEF 1 million at the end of the day. 3 months later, we got 25 million in from Chanel. With the Chanel money, we did a first investment in a company called COA Impact Ghana, which uses the juice of cocoa plants and basically creates an additional source of income from something that would be thrown away otherwise. And at the end and at the same time it provides training, and it creates an additional income for 10,000 farmers on the ground. So you have like from this 1 million, 25 million, and then I forgot one step in between, basically because we did this loan to COA Impact Ghana, they got additional financing several times that amount. So kind of there are 4 layers, plus the money is a loan and will hopefully come back and can be used several times. So there are so many levels of leverage in the system that I believe it's a very good vehicle. So coming back to the initial question, so I think corporates want to invest into this topic generally. So when they want to clean up their own supply chains, they want to be able to take measures, and they want to have a positive press for this. So I guess we can all work jointly for creating vehicles that are beyond doubt, where corporates can invest, and and as well creating a positive momentum, creating positive press, and kind of getting as well the press on board. The press often tries to find the problems in something rather than the good things. Could be another layer.
Christoph, I appreciate your reflections on motivations of the corporates that you're working with so closely. Supply chain resilience, de-risking, crucial for our understanding of opportunities moving forwards. On that, Maelis, the Catalyst Fund, in a sense, works with somewhat different type of businesses than some of the other funds we're talking to. FinTech. Can you give us a feel of the type of companies that you're investing in and their motivations?
Absolutely. And I think, as it was mentioned just a moment ago, the universe of climate adaptation and resilience solutions is actually quite vast. And so you may sit here and wonder, like, what's FinTech got to do with anything? what's its role, right? So let me tell you a little bit about our thesis. We actually invest across 3 main verticals. The first vertical is climate smart financial services. And so there you have solutions that are, let's call them FinTech first, but include things like era yield crop insurance, weather index-based insurance, emergency payment solutions in the case of a disaster, so for emergency response, or data infrastructure to better underwrite credit models, insurance models that can actually play a role in enabling climate resilience. But then we also have 2 other verticals, one focused on livelihoods, so bringing solutions to communities whose lives, income, livelihood depends on resources that will be affected by climate change. And there we have regenerative agriculture, agri-tech, reforestation, fishery management, aquaculture. In all of these solutions, you tend to have a FinTech component embedded into the product so that it can be radically affordable and accessible for low-income communities. And I'll give you an example. In our portfolio, we have several companies in the agri space. All of them are providing access, say, to drought-resistant seeds, so inputs, right, for the farmers, and they're combining that with market access, but also with insurance if there's a season without rain, right? They're also including embedded credit, so they can actually purchase the seeds at the moment where they actually need to plant it and not at the peak of harvest season or when their resources are low. And so we see a lot of power in the combination of finance or FinTech elements into the agriculture, for example, marketplace that I was mentioning, to again drive that adoption and drive the affordability of the products. And then the third vertical that we have is actually focused on climate smart essential services. So there we have solutions such as cooling and cold chain or cold storage for goods, right, for farmers. I was recently in Nigeria, and the largest market, one of the largest markets in Nigeria, 80% of food produce goes to waste every day in the market. So what this company we invested in is doing is offering cold chain storage facilities, so you can store your tomatoes and actually have them for several days and not have them go to waste in one day. So it increases the shelf life from 3 days to more than 3 weeks, just having a facility. But obviously farmers and the stallers in the market front can pay for it. So they have a digital payment system, so they broke down the payment of the storage in small units, and that allows the solution to actually be affordable. So we see huge potential in this universe at this nexus, so that the solution can actually reach those that need it most. So that hopefully gives you a sense of the kind of opportunities we look at, but it's very broad because I think, again, the universe is vast, there's so much to be built, there's so much potential, so we're trying to stay flexible in our approach.
That's just, isn't it? I mean, when we're talking about climate adaptation, we're talking about climate impact. It's every sector, every business. There is the number of investment funds and facilities. There's no limit for space. Very well taken that you made at the very beginning. Okay, so here we are in the GCF-GEF Pavilion. The GCF and the GEF have a clear mandate, desire, momentum, a vision for a long-term vision for coherence and complementarity. This also applies to our work on investment funds, public-private investment funds. Increasingly, we have with us present David Macaulay, who's a senior advisor to the GEF and the GCF on coherence and complementarity. Maybe, David, we'd be delighted if you'd like to share some reflections during the discussion portion. Right now, Nadine, share with us some reflections. You know, there's discussions, lots of people have discussions. Share some reflections on how it could potentially work.
Does it work? Yes. Okay. Yeah, very interesting subject. And as I said, FAO is both an implementing agency and an accredited entity, implementing agency to GEF, and accredited entity to GCF. So we see the two sides of it. For the Sustainable Rice Landscape Initiative, the idea, so this is starting with initial funding from the GEF, but there are already some initial discussions with the GCF to see how this could be scaled up with your neighbors, how this could be scaled up after this initial grant has been done and the facility can be set up. And actually, it would be, at least from FAO, if we continue to be associated, it would be really interesting because we would be going and trying to tap into the private sector facility of the GCF. And we see this as a wonderful opportunity to see how the seed fund from the GEF would enable us to leverage partners and networks, and the GCF would provide the de-risking funding that is needed to also attract additional funding. But I'll be a little bit provocative before I give the floor to my neighbor. All of us here, I mean the host countries of the vertical funds, the partners, private sector, the UN organizations, CSOs, we are all thrilled and excited of the possibility to demonstrate concretely how GEF and GCF could complement and could be more coherent. It's really key for all of us and for the funds. But as an agency working with GEF and GCF, we would like to call for quicker review and approval, fast track maybe, I don't know if this is too ambitious, so that we can match the speed of the private sector investors. And more importantly, or as importantly, the urgency required to address climate change now. And I think that's one of the major challenges we are all aware of, and I think there is a lot of work to be done, and would be very happy to be part of these follow-up discussions. Thank you.
Nadine, thank you for being provocative. You can't move forwards if you're not provocative. And to be provocative as somebody who's worked inside both GCF and GEF secretariats, ways to speed it up, ways to fast track, to call it that, certain elements, are needed and welcome. We do have ongoing, David will speak to this in much more depth, but ongoing analysis of those opportunities, and so we need to do what's possible. Okay, Patrick, back to you to wrap up the panel. What's next? What's next for the working group on metrics? Please, what can we do next?
Thank you, Jason. So we have carried out this landscape analysis. We are at the moment looking into case studies. So we have looked into the conceptual framework, if you want, the methodology, but we want to see how those are applied in practice and derive lessons from that. So that is a concrete next step, Jason. We want to gather feedback from the working paper that we are publishing during the climate conference. And then with this and the stakeholders that are interested, able, and willing to contribute, we want to define what the next steps are going to be going into next year. Trying to project myself forward, Jason, if I may, to me, this ideal tool to help us guide decisions around climate finance adaptation should have, or ideally has, the following attributes. First of all, it should be grounded in science. I think this is important that we rely on science on climate adaptation, and there is enough of that to be able to have a tool that speaks to that science. Yet, it must be practical, so it must be understandable by those that are using that tool, applying that tool, and making use of its outcome. Second, it must be lean on input. We all know that access to data is very often a critical challenge. But at the same time, it must make the most of the available technology and the available climate science data that is out there. And I see a huge missed opportunity from that perspective. How fantastic would it be if we could make that climate science data available to those that are making decisions around farmers so that they know what's coming to them in the next 5, 10, 20 years. That is not available to them at the moment. It should also be modular, so we know that the capacity is low. So ideally, that tool starts like an onion. You have a core that is absolutely required, and then you can use layers around it to build the capacity and increase the complexity if you can and if you want. And then most importantly, it has to have some legitimacy. It needs to inform decisions, particularly support to SMEs and investments into SME. So we need to do that with those that are going to apply that tool to make sure that we have the buy-in of those that are making decisions on the basis of that tool.
Patrick, those principles are both practical and necessary. Really useful to lay those out. If I can just pick up on two of them, science-based, rigorous, science-based, at the same time usable. And there's a balance there. Rigorous, usable, and if I could, and also highlight used, commonly used. If only Lightsmith uses one, Southpole uses another, you use another one at BFA, etc. Disjointed system. The TNFD principles, I think it's principle number 6, common use. So how can we do that? We know adaptation is complex. We're so grateful that this is being taken on by BFA, by UNIDO, by others. The GEF is actively involved in it. We hope we can grow the work together. Others invited, and together with the Gary working group with Lightsmith. Okay, we thank you so much to the panelists. So much insight, so rich. Really appreciate that. In the audience, sorry, we don't have capacity for those who are watching us virtually to hear you through this venue. But please, anyone in the physical room, your insights or questions for the panelists. Please. We have to do it by microphone so it can be heard. I'll come to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I am a scientist by education and now a PhD student studying climate change. I just so happen to also be interested in climate finance. So I'm curious, knowing that there is a gap in communication between scientists and their outputs and the rest of the world, how you define usable science.
How we define usable science. Okay, I'd actually like to take, thank you. I'd like to take a couple of comments and reflections, and then we'll come back. David McCauley, if we could, let's come to you, including on the GEF GCF synergies piece.
Thanks. Really great to see this progress and the evolution of it. I have shifted from WWF now, and I'm advising a number of clients, including GEF and GCF. Yeah, I'm tempted to react to everybody because it's really exciting to see how this is so timely. It's really at the interface of all of the sort of top interests. The international public sector community is emphasizing the need for adaptation support, whether through GEF and GCF or other channels, and they're simultaneously looking to leverage private investment because there's a recognition that public support can only go so far. So you're sitting at this unique interface. There is a huge need for better metrics. I just came from a seminar talking about ISSB and the standards that are coming there, which are mostly on mitigation, obviously, following on TCFD, but they're next year going to be looking at nature, biodiversity, and so the interface there, as well as adaptation elements. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, and so you should be in touch with them, maybe invite someone into your working group to think about how that might go. On the GEF GCF cooperation front, we are looking at the policies and procedures of both funds. We're also looking at the adaptation fund as well as the climate investment funds, and even because this is one of those rare issues where both the contributing countries and the recipient countries, for somewhat different reasons, absolutely agree it's important that we work on these topics. So, you know, listening to all of this, I'm happy to follow up after, but it does get down to who are the accredited partners. You mentioned, you know, so FAO or UNIDO. You mentioned IFC. So IFC it's eligible through GEF, but it's sort of backed away from GCF. Another one of my friends receiving advisory support from me is Asian Development Bank. I used to be climate director there, so I know them well. And you might want to consider them too. Particularly their private sector arm is quite hungry right now. We can talk about that. So I think that you'll see a continued push for harmonization to the extent that's possible, and you know how hard that is. But it's coming from all sides. And as the increased international funding, this pledge to double adaptation funding by 2025 has to materialize. And as the new financial architecture for climate action takes shape between now and 2024, whether that includes you know, post-Bretton Woods 2.0, it certainly will include something called the new collective quantitative goal for climate finance, which is kind of post 100 billion framework. I came in on Saturday and moderated the pre-COP dialogue on that, and I'd say that they need more of these kinds of perspectives in that group to better understand where things need to go. That's yet another conversation we should be having, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
David, there was so much there, so a lot to reflect on. I think maybe I hope we'll have time for a quick reflection from each of us on that GEF GCF synergies, post $100 billion framework, metrics, links with nature, biodiversity. Okay, Alois from UNIDO. Yes.
Thank you, Jason, and actually quite privileged to have joined this conversation. Looking at the scale of interventions here, from BFA Global with early stage to what Brian is doing with the 185 million, to what Patrick is doing with the metrics. To me, this talks to a sector that is going through rapid and disruptive innovation. And associated with this is the need to promote a lot of learning and knowledge management. Because we need more and more of what Brian is doing. We need the matrix to be available, accessible to as many investors so that we can start to have to talk from investors to the SMEs. I think, perhaps one of the ways that we can also look at this is how do we promote learning and knowledge management into this space so that we actually support the ramping up of all these funds and investment in climate adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alois. We would like to now come. Oh, please, thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'm Jacinta Higgs from the Bahamas, and Mr. Yannick just met with our Prime Minister and the full delegation. I really want to say we are sincerely grateful to both GEF and Green Climate Fund because there are two projects going on now in our country with regards to research. I want to say that I am integrally involved with the Green Climate Fund as a gender specialist. My question to both of you is the involvement of civil society in general. How can you insist on provide the mandates for that to happen? Because I'm hearing in a beautiful way GCF and GEF in terms of your harmonization, but I'm telling you there will still be a gap existing if there is not a greater harmonization between civil society organizations and the government. And so just wanting to put that in there as you put in little clauses or as you begin to think, because it's going to be very, very important. And then just coming off the heel of the young lady in her area, my specialty is in education. I'm a 40-year veteran educator. And I've heard Excellency Mia Motley just around the corner tell young people, the room was packed with young people, and she shared with them to read and to know and to study and to be abreast because she was talking about passing on the baton. But you know what I've not heard in any of your conversations? Where is the curriculum? Is there, because if you want to help perpetuate a thinking that is sustainable but has validity and the substantive nature, it must be written at an 8th grade level. And so where is that global document? And I heard you were so brilliant, all of you. You are powerful, but where is the documents and the curriculum for the young people and the children, for your grandchildren? Where is it? Thank you very much. So help me with funding for capacity building for the vulnerable groups. So the research I did was for vulnerable groups. I heard you. There were 9 of them that we focused on. I just did it 2 weeks ago. And by the way, for me, this is real because literally we just got photos from our families. Our country is under flood right now. The same two islands, Abaco and Grand Bahama, literally that Hurricane Dorian devastated, decimated, that Antonio Guterres came and said it was a hurricane from hell, that the people are still living in cars and in abandoned buildings. Literally, the hurricane is upon them right now, and they were already walking around as zombies. The psychosocial assistance, we don't have that full capacity. So I bless you in terms of the both organizations. Literally, there are 2 projects going on right now in our country. The first from both of you, and we are very, very grateful at a government level. Civil society a little bit, but I just want to say capacity building, please. Thank you.
Thank you for that sense of reality and urgency, and our wishes to people in Bahamas right now who are dealing with the reality of climate impacts, and may we have ambitious decisions here made at the COP. I'd like to come back to the panel for a round of final reflections. A lot said, please reflect on that, as well as what you've heard from your colleagues on the panel. We'll start at the far end with Patrick, and then we're going to sort of move the microphone this way. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Jason. I'll take the question on usable science. So what is usable science? If you ask the academic, I would say any science is usable, no? Including fundamental science. But I'm going to give you a more practical answer. I sat last week with 3 companies, preparing them to pitch their business at this climate conference. And then we worked on their climate adaptation thesis. And we broke down what the climate says. So the risk is a function of the climate hazards, the exposure, and the vulnerability. And once they understand this and they get some hints on what those climate hazards is, what exposure is, and what vulnerability could look like, and how their product and their services could influence those 2 factors, because that's the only 2 you can influence, then they can start to get their head around what is a potential positive benefits that their business is making. So it does require some effort to turn the science, depending on where it comes, to something that is usable to make decision on investment, but it is certainly feasible.
Yeah, thank you. First, I would like to thank David for his very rich intervention and lines of thought about harmonization and the push for harmonization. So very much welcome continuing beyond that. I would like to come back to the comment from the representative from the Bahamas and calling for more involvement of civil society organizations. That's certainly something key in all GEF and GCF projects. I think these are 2 funds which really play a lot of attention and ask their partners to pay extreme attention to involvement of CSOs. And by saying involvement of CSOs, I don't think any of us here mean just making sure that the CSOs receive the report. What we actually mean is involving the CSOs during the formulation, engaging in a dialogue with the CSOs, and having the CSOs as partners during implementation. So just want to, I represent FAO, the UN, but I can tell you, I mean, with GEF and GCF, that's really a very strong requirement we all have, and we all are very happy to comply with. Thank you.
Yeah, still on? So I think I'd like to also come back to 2 points that were made. One is a reflection that there's so much knowledge just on this panel, but this is the first time that we all interact. This first time we actually hear like what the history has been for craft, for Southpole, also the work at FAO and UNIDO. I think that GEF and GCF would have a tremendous role in actually facilitating this knowledge exchange, not just for harmonization, but actually exchange of knowledge resources to make more solutions available in the market faster. Because again, speed comes on the capital side, but speed also matters when you're creating and launching a new product to market. It took us months to figure out, the structuring and how to do this best, when perhaps, just a conversation with Lightsmith could have saved us months. So I think more of this would be tremendously helpful, and I think there's definitely a call for knowledge exchange, lessons learned, sharing, being in the room all together as a real community to face the climate crisis, as well as harmonization. And then on your point of where's the curriculum, I couldn't agree more that youth has the most important role, if not the critical role to play to combat climate change. And honestly, it's more urgent than ever for them. But how do you actually translate that urgency into action? Has to come from the early days, as you said. But I don't know that it is in a curriculum. Perhaps it's in enabling the youth to take agency and having initiatives that allow them to actually transform their intentions into concrete ideas and projects. So to give you an example, we just launched an initiative called TECA, Triggering Exponential Climate Action, that is trying to help young entrepreneurs with a vision and a dream to actually turn those ideas into viable businesses and launch basically climate ventures in the markets. That spirit of entrepreneurship, how you build a business, how you actually turn an idea into a solution, I think it's actually one of the best lessons one could learn. And speaking for experience as well as an entrepreneur and having had the luxury also of education, right, that goes beyond what most people on the planet have access to. And I think that those programs are really essential, and I hope we can see many more of those like TECAs in the world very soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think the example of the Bahamas shows that that we don't have any time anymore for talking, but we have to do real action, and I think we have to do this action jointly. We've seen it here in the room. There was a lot of talk about collaboration, and we can work, and the market is big, and we can all work together and whatever. But I don't see this generally happening here, even at COP or in this field. I think we have to use all levers jointly now. We don't have any time fighting for we have to be constructive, let's put it this way. And so there are levers which are basically finance. You can do impact finance. There are other levers around market mechanisms, and there are levers about just governments putting certain regulations. And we still, at least in our field, we still see quite a lot of fights by quite a number of players who simply don't like market mechanisms, and they just put all their efforts into destroying market mechanisms in the hope that then money would probably be donated. And I think there is no time for these fights anymore. I think we have to be all constructive on all levels and work together and be, and science, of course, I think is extremely helpful with all the IPCC reports. You need all this fundamental work. Science is it's such a broad question, but it's always a question, is it really realistic what I'm saying now? For example, I've seen at the Climate Week in New York studies being done about how many billions and hundreds of billions would flow eventually under this Article 6 from the US to China and Russia and whatever. And in the hope of all these hundreds of billions money flowing, countries like India or Indonesia already stopped market-based mechanisms and stopped all the voluntary markets. And then in that case, nobody has done any good, right? I mean, we have to check if it's really realistic that this money will be flowing. Maybe it will be flowing in 100 years, but not now. And let's make sure we use all the mechanisms we have now, and that we are constructively working together.
Okay. So I agree with lots of the comments that came from the other panelists. I'd like to maybe visit a little bit on the science question. And so with the climate adaptation solutions taxonomy that we use to kind of look for small and medium enterprises, and also the basis for our company search for the fund, we look for direct impacts of climate change. So we use the science as a basis for proving that solutions qualify as a climate adaptation solution. So we look for places that have water stress, or places where energy consumption is so high because there's a need for air conditioning. So solutions are contextual to the impacts that are happening in locale of where the solutions are being delivered, and that's where we draw upon the science the most. And then to follow on for the information systems, we've done an initial scoping of climate adaptation solutions. We found over 400 companies in our global search, and many of them include an information spreading element to the solutions that they provide, whether it's contextualizing it in a local language and or a local context, so that the person who's not necessarily well-versed in climate change can understand and take action for it. And so, I think that's a really important aspect to a lot of the technology-enabled solutions that we're looking at, especially using mobile devices. And then I want to just touch on the urgency of the need for investing in these companies. We've had the flooding in the Bahamas. We had the massive flooding that happened in Pakistan recently, and the fires in many places around the world. And not every, we're not going to be able to solve everything with one company investment, but there's lots of companies out there that'll help deal with certain impacts that happen from climate change. For instance, there was flooding in Chennai, India, last Christmas around the time, and one of our portfolio companies is Way Cool Foods, which is an agricultural supply chain company, and they were able to still deliver all of their products and foods so that people could eat despite the flooding. They rented boats and were able to distribute the food so that people, while they were still dealing with the loss of their homes, they didn't have to worry about the food. And so every company that we invest in has a role to play in the adaptation solution. We need to build this ecosystem of investors, but then also an ecosystem of companies who are engaging with the civil society, the government. It's going to take all of us to be able to really move towards that adapted society that we want to live in.
Great. I'm gonna bring in one more reflection and then say some thank yous. I'd like to come back to end where we started. We started talking about the importance of bringing our collective strengths together, public-private finance, for investment funds, for localized adaptation impacts at scale. And sometimes I get really overwhelmed by the climate catastrophe that's unfolding. And sometimes I realize that actually not very long ago we were on panels like this talking about saying that, climate adaptation is a public good, private sector engagement and adaptation, that's for mitigation. We've come a long way pretty quickly. That was about 2 years ago we were saying that nonsense. We need to bring our collective strengths together, use the limited, too bloody limited public finance to catalyze it big scale. There's plenty of public resources out there. Any company that's not thinking about their climate risks has their head in the sand. Any community, any household that's not thinking about climate risks has their head in the water in the case of Bahamas. And okay, so we're making progress, a lot more to do. We need not just a craft and a landscape resilience fund, and we need a movement. And so thank you for the point, Maelis, on sharing, knowledge, sharing, learning. We will continue this together with partners, Gary, UNIDO, many others involved. Thank you. And now I'm going to say thank yous to everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. I hope this is a journey that will deepen together. Thank you for everyone. Thank you, Bahamas, for your insights. And your challenges at the front line. And thank you for your time, everyone.